Hello and welcome everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you all for taking some time to join us for this exclusive session, Cloud-Based Solutions, The Sky is the Limit for Retail Success, presented by Experience Retail today and sponsored by Fluid. I'm Tara, the webinar coordinator for Experience Retail today, and I'm so excited to bring you this new event with such a well-earned insight into the multitude of benefits that cloud technology brings to retailers. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Ryan Bryers today, and what I'm sure is going to be a valuable and illuminating conversation. Also, we will be recording this webinar in case you have to leave early, and it will be sent out to you within 48 hours of today's session. We're going to send the link to the landing page in the chat box right now so you can make sure your email is registered. Up next, I do want to go ahead and thank Fluid for sponsoring this webinar and helping us to make all of this happen. Fluid empowers retailers to create seamless, flexible, resilient customer interactions in retail spaces like never before. Fluid is a market-leading unified commerce platform provider, enabling retail and hospitality brands to sell to customers flexibly and consistently wherever they are and whenever they need to shop. Their cloud-native open API composable solutions and services allow retailers to reduce purchasing barriers with solutions that make checkout seamless and enable mobile interaction and curbside pickup, enhance customer experiences while reducing contact risks with interactive self-service checkout points, utilize point-of-service devices, and harness the power of data to get a holistic picture of store operations for near real-time insights on sales, operator performance, and loss prevention. Use personalization and flexible, open, and agnostic configuration options to give shoppers a tailored experience anywhere in the store, immersing customers and associates in your brand, all powered by Intel technologies. Create your compelling customer shopping journey today with Fluid. Visit fluid.com for more information. So thank you again to Fluid. Up next, let's get some technical things out of the way. Please don't hesitate to ask questions or make comments during today's session. You can do so by submitting anything and everything into the Q&A panel found on the bottom bar of this webinar window. Great questions make for a great webinar, so don't forget to stick around for our Q&A session near the end of the hour to get even more insight from Ryan. My wonderful colleague, Tori, will be fielding your questions today. She'll be happy to answer anything technical you might have, so feel free to pull up the Q&A panel, say hello, let her know that you're listening. Lastly, if you do have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may choose to dial in by phone. You can find all dial-in information in your webinar confirmation email from Zoom. The numbers are on screen now for you as well, and Tori can also relay them to you at any point if you need them. So today we'll be hearing from Ryan Bryers. Ryan, I'm going to step out of the way and pass everything over to you from here on out.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess good afternoon, good morning or good evening, depending where you are in the world. Okay, so if we get straight into it then, I'm going to probably talk for about 40 minutes, hopefully 35, 40 minutes. I'll try not to overstay my welcome too much. But just a little background about me to start with. I've obviously been in IT now for over 30 years, and I try not to count anymore once you get above 30 years. I have worked across a number of sectors, as it shows up there, and I've actually been employed 6 times, but worked for 10 companies. I've had the pleasure of working for companies who've changed their name several times. I've worked a variety of roles as well, which gives me a great perspective. I've been right in the detail of applications development, right into testing management. I've been buried in infrastructure as an architect, and worked my way through to roles like enterprise architect, CTO, CIO, and now currently my SVP role in Fluid. Obviously, work is work. I do have elements that give me some sanity. So I've been a footballer most of my life. I played to some very high levels in the UK. And obviously, if you're in the US, apologies, I do mean soccer. I do love the gym. I do love working out and using that as a way to de-stress at the end of the day. And I also do love golf. In fairness, at times golf doesn't love me, but we're building our relationship at the moment. So in the next sort of, say, 35, 40 minutes, what I'm going to just take you through, I guess, is my cloud exposure since probably the middle of sort of 2006, 2007 onwards. things that I've learned, I've got a few professional tips for you to consider, because obviously people will be considering their journey to cloud or whether cloud is the right thing for them. I'm going to tell you how I see cloud. Others will see it differently. It is a very subjective topic. And my aim is really to give you a perspective to help you choose cloud or things to think about when choosing cloud. I'm going to do my best not to focus on just one cloud, a GCP or an AWS or an Azure. I will try and talk about most of them. And as you've already seen, there'll be a bunch of icons along the way. So just a shout out to the guys at Fab Icons. They have some superb icons. So if you're building web solutions, definitely somewhere to go. Okay, so the first time I really got a cloud ask was, I think it was 2007, 2008. Again, I'm 52 years of age now, so I'm allowed to have a little bit of mild brain fade along the way. But my client was the NHS at the time, a program called the National Program for IT. They'd been to an AWS conference. Obviously, AWS was growing at that point in time, and they'd heard some great things. And they came back saying, we want everything. Effectively, they're asking for the moon on a stick. They're a great bunch of guys we work with. They're always pushing the boundaries. So they're very sort of innovative type of clients. What they came back with is they wanted to save money. They wanted to reduce the cost of their environments. And at that point in time, environments took 12 weeks to set up, which I know currently in 2023 sounds horrific. But we had it really quite finely tuned at that point. There was a 4-week CapEx cycle, delivery of hardware, rack the hardware, network the hardware, plug it into an environment, configure the network, deploy the middleware, deploy the application, the whole process. And it was very people intensive. And generally, we got it quite right in about 12 weeks. Risk, obviously, if the CapEx was a bit late or delivery times were out, it could go to sort of 16 weeks. And you had problems. You had problems where maybe your environment 7 you've just built didn't work quite like environment 6. And, you'd have a scratchy head moment wondering how on earth we've built it wrong. But again, it was built around people. Now, if you compare that to now, I could probably build that in under an hour. But that was my first exposure. So it was the first time a client had said to me, I want something where it will spin up and spin down. I don't want to pay for it when I don't need it. And obviously at that point in time, environments sat up permanently overnight. So whilst they were talking about cost, cost was kind of their big thing. What they were really saying, and they didn't realize it at the time, is they were talking about the illities, which we talk about a lot in IT. So the concept of availability, extensibility, repeatability, reliability, and scalability, that was what they were actually asking for. They wanted their environments to be repeatable and reliable. They wanted to see the same thing built quickly, and they obviously wanted to see it be the same as previously. They wanted it to be extensible because these are generally environments of 10 to 15 people, but at the same time, they also wanted it to be scalable. They wanted to bring it up and down. They wanted to scale it up when they did some testing, and they wanted to literally turn it off when they weren't doing it. And obviously, they wanted it to be quite available. Now, all of those illities, as we call them, are now pretty common in cloud language. And obviously, there's more and more coming out. So interoperability, securability, security's always been a big question mark in and around cloud, and that's something I will get onto in a little bit. But usability and visibility, people want to make it easier and more simple to interact with the cloud. Now, I would add on to that things like flexibility, maintainability, and portability. Maintainability is certainly a big one for me. I think cloud can change the way that you maintain solutions, and actually the way that cloud works these days and the solutions and services that are on there, they can enable you to do actually less work, less of the grunt work, and offload that grunt work to the system and free your people to do higher valuable stuff. So I guess my first pro tip of the day would be, if you're heading towards a cloud decision, don't come at it the same way the NHS came to me in 2007, 2008. It's not about cost. If you make it solely about cost saving, I think you've probably gone down the wrong path. The right path really is about the business agility. What can the cloud do for you? So that's certainly the first guidance I will give anybody looking at cloud is think about, what can it do for you? Can it enable your pace, your innovation? Is it transformational? are you modernizing what you've currently got? But it's definitely about enabling the agility of your business. It's not about cost saving. There probably is a cost saving in there, but if you're literally comparing one value against another, it's not going to be a huge number. In terms of the evolution of cloud, and again, most people will probably have a good handle on this, but again, it's sometimes a good reminder and a starting point. Is these hyperscale cloud providers like AWS, Azure, and Google, they're investing in the billions. It's not small investment. Their R&D budget is huge. I was fortunate in some ways in the early 2010s to be working at Atos. Again, it was Atos where I was when I was working with NP Fit and the NHS. We decided to try and create our own cloud capability at the same time AWS was growing and Azure was trying to compete. But we found we couldn't compete even back then, 2012. AWS was investing about $1 billion a year at that point, and we were, it was a big investment for us at 20 million. It was a very, very difficult challenge to meet, to try and compete with someone who has not necessarily endless funds, but considerably more funds than you have. And in terms of the R&D side, they were investing in technology way faster than anyone else could. So this really started to generate the concept of cloud first principles during my time as a consultant from sort of 2018, 19 onwards. A lot of the OKRs you would do with clients, you would see the concept of cloud first as a principle. And I think that was something that, as you can see on the right, even the government who initially resisted the migration to cloud this is UK government, of course, they kind of gave up themselves around 2013 and then implemented their own cloud first policy. Typically, like most people, their initial resistance and reluctance was on security grounds. The concern that cloud wasn't secure, and actually you were more secure in secure data center. But again, if you look at the numbers that AWS and Google, as an example, are investing over the next 3 to 5 years, it's very hard for anyone to try and compete with that in the security ground. I do see some challenges. Some people who maybe are in the US are maybe aligned to US government, not restrictions, but rules. They might need FedRAMP certification. And certainly clients I'm aware of in Africa who are really keen to go into cloud, while Google themselves has no current presence in Africa, although that is going to be resolved Q1 next year. So there are still reasons people might not go in, but I think some of the historic reasons around security for certain and the ability to R&D and invest, I think really have been blown out of the water by the ability and the scale of the hyperscale cloud providers. So I guess that second pro tip is kind of an obvious one, is you're not going to outspend the cloud, and I guess the question you have to answer is whether or not it's the culture of your own company, or has it always been a company that's wanted to host? We talk in IT about being able to touch the kit. I get security from feeling that I can touch the kit and influence the kit at a hardware level, which I can't do when it's in the cloud. Is that a culture? Is that habit? And actually, if you compare the abilities that we talked about earlier around your availability, security, and so on, that's the best way to determine whether or not the cloud can offer you something more than maybe an on-premise solution. And again, remember what we said back in point one is, I think don't base it all on cost. I think you should consider cost, of course, but if you literally base the whole thing on cost, I think you'll probably come up with the wrong answer. So let's just talk a little bit about retail service solution providers. So obviously, I work in one in Fluid, and we've obviously evolved ourselves, and again, the we here is service providers in the retail domain. Is most retail providers now are offering some sort of cloud capability, and if you look on the right, the diagram, solutions are based on multiple layers. You got your infrastructure layer, your middleware layer, and the software that sits on top, which is where the features are that you operate. And that's supported by automation and monitoring. And again, you could quite rightly say, well, that's no different to on-premise. But certainly what we're seeing, or certainly what I'm seeing through my consultancy days, and I've been doing pre-sales bids since 2001. Over the last 5-6 years, cloud questions are pretty normal in RFIs and RFPs from all retailers. It's almost the point where it's a surprise if an RFI and RFP has no questions around cloud or what does your cloud do. There's still a leaning towards wanting a virtual private cloud. That's give you your element of your segregation versus somebody else. And the concept of SaaS offerings, again, is what is being asked for. Clients that maybe service providers have that have maybe had for some time, maybe there's contracts you've had for say 10, 15 years that have maybe been done in an on-premise solution, they are also migrating as well. They're migrating away, they're transforming, and they're taking the opportunity to move into cloud because of the benefits that cloud will bring. So cloud migration projects are also really quite common. And again, they move in the same sort of way, looking for those SaaS offerings in a virtual private cloud. We do, though, still see RFI and RFPs that are looking for on-premise capability. And again, this comes back to people who maybe have over time had the solutions on premise. It's habitual, maybe the culture, there's maybe been a large investment in data center capability or data room capability, and there's a desire to keep pushing that. But that does have an impact on the service provider. And I guess the question I would probably ask there is, it sometimes can feel like the question is, well, we just want your software, we want to run your software because we like your software. And it's simple, it's just software, correct? Well, the reality, like that the diagram shows on the right, which evolves a little bit here above, is it's a little bit more than that, because when you're assuring a product, you don't just assure the software, you assure the build. And again, if you go back to what I was saying back in 2007, 2008 about the problems around environment A isn't working the same as environment B, because again, they were largely built more manually. You assure everything in the build. You ensure how the operating system is deployed. You assure how the middleware is deployed and configured, and how the application is deployed and configured. It's largely driven through automation build, but the whole stack, certainly from a service provider now, is almost an entire offering. While the product is largely seen at the application software level, the entire build is a reference architecture. It's a reference deployment upon which things are tested. And if you happen to change one of those layers, or maybe misconfigure it, or don't configure it in the same way it was assured, you do then run into problems. So the cloud provider is focused, the service provider, who's obviously got a cloud thinking now, is focused very much at the managed service level. How can I deploy this service and run it and manage it in an optimal way? How can I build it once and run it in many times, which is again the automation. Centralized R&D will focus on how this is operated and deployed in a cloud environment, while the support and the tooling and the management again is tuned to the cloud environment. The minute you take just the application software piece out, all of that R&D and all of that investment is then a problem, because you're essentially saying that you will then take this on and you will build it. It affects some of those abilities. So your reliability and repeatability might not be correct. The reference build potentially isn't going to be the same, and that could have knock-on consequences to availability. So again, it is a risk. And again, what I would say is, when talking to a service provider who's very much cloud focused and is trying to sell services on a cloud basis, just trying to take their application software is likely to give you some challenges. And something to certainly think about in that space would be, what is the cost that you would have to replicate effectively for the work that they've already done? So if you consider something from a cloud provider who's maybe only, say, 3 years into delivery of a product, which is a relatively young product, and maybe has a very small team of around 6 people, that 3 years of investment is likely 36,000 hours of work. Now, if you're just going to take the software and you want to host it yourself and run it yourself, because obviously that's your preference, and maybe not seeing at this point that cloud is where you want to go, you've got to literally replicate 36,000 hours of investment just to stand still. So the question you have to ask is that a good use of your time and investment? Is that the right thing to do? Because you've got a lot of hours to catch up just to get to the point where the cloud provider has got to. And in that time of you trying to catch up, they will have moved forward again. So I would never obviously come here and say, listen, don't don't do this, don't take it on premise. But I would say certainly really think of the risk. Think of the impact of trying to take something that's built and tuned for one environment and deliver it in another environment. It does drive the risk up. Now, I guess here, in terms of the choices we as service providers or solution providers have got, we've been through a series of steps. So we've already trodden the path that someone will have to tread if they're going to start moving into the cloud. So the virtual machine cloud era was kind of that first step of people, around 2000, mid 2000s to 2010, had started to move to virtual machines. So they started the foray to move into cloud and say, well, I'll move my on-premise virtual machines into cloud, and now I've cloud enabled now, and I'm taking the advantages of cloud. It was more like infrastructure hosting in some ways, really, that migration. Again, a good start, but it's more of an exploration. They're starting to explore what cloud can do and start to feel comfortable with it. As they got more and more comfortable, they started to dip more than the toe into the water. You started to take advantage of more of the opportunities around the infrastructure and start to embed and be more happier in the network configuration, and start to take advantage of some of the infrastructure services that were there to help you. And I think now, certainly, service providers are at that transformation cloud perspective. It is a case of now jumping in with 2 feet. Use that to configure it, and it's what cloud opens the door to. Cloud isn't just about hosting your solution; it's about all the add-ons that are there. There are so many SaaS tools out there. The workloads that you operate can change in their behavior. So you can take services to run your database, for example. I think database is always a good example. And the pain and overhead that DBAs have had for many, many years can go away a little bit, because the services, the SaaS services, can now operate much of the grunt work, the tuning work that DBAs have had to work so hard on over time. And they can take that role on. They can take on how the data is persisted. They can take on how the data is encrypted at rest, how the data is transferred between disaster recovery and business continuity zones. And in doing that, you can free your people to work at a much higher level. You can have them free to work at a level that adds more business value. So they can focus maybe considerably more on how the application works and tuning, or how it can be optimized constantly, as opposed to having to worry really about what we used to call the feeding and watering of the solution. So in terms of the cloud retailers, or what cloud offers to retailers, I want to just go back to some of those illities we talked about a little bit earlier. So availability, and I think the concept of the clouds is based around regions and availability zones. And the way to probably break that down and explain it is, a region is effectively a cluster of data centers. So it's within a geographic region, most likely probably within a 3 to 5 mile radius. So it's not going to give you full disaster recovery. So if you go way back in our day, we used to look at, minimum 25, 30 miles separation, probably even further, really, separation between data centers, and then obviously starting to calculate the mathematical algorithms of how far a data center could be without your latency getting too poor. The concept of cloud now is, obviously, here's a region. Within a region, we have the availability zones, which is effectively 3 data centers, and they're all on the same network infrastructure backbone. The deployment of services like the database services I talked about before, those services are deployed and striped across all 3 of those data centers. So you immediately get, well, I'm going to call it more business continuity. Within the region, if a data center had a problem, the other 2 will simply pick it up. The information is shared between it. It's obviously replicated at high speed because it's such a small area. And things like Azure, as an example, Azure SQL is able to offer 99.995 availability with 0 recovery point objective. So they're saying we can absolutely lose 0 data in this period, and actually we're up all the year with minimal outages. So if you're starting to plan your application that might use some sort of cloud SQL capability, you can be really quite confident that is going to be always on for you. And the point 0 005 that it isn't available is largely due for maintenance work. So they are that confident in their availability. And each of the cloud providers is the same. Each cloud provider has very, very similar capability. And it also means that you don't have to worry about the things that you really had to worry about many, many years ago. You know, we used to have to think about the storage config. How am I going to configure out the data to transfer between the data centers? How big does a network cable need to be? You know, I've then got to go to third party, maybe have that cable installed. I've got to worry about my redundancy. You're actually now starting to work 1, 2, or 3 levels up because you don't have to worry about that anymore. So again, it frees your people for those higher value tasks. The repeatability and reliability, and my first guide here is whatever you do, don't read the words that are on the slide. For me, this is a really good reason why techies don't do marketing. It's clearly some tech words written for tech people, but the concept behind this is really quite simple. Infrastructure as code, as a term you've probably heard, or probably software-defined data centers, is the way that we now build in cloud. And in fairness, you can build this outside of cloud. Is you can build with comfort and you can build with confidence that an environment you build on today and you build another one tomorrow will be identical. It is software defined. It is byte compatible. It is literally infrastructure as code as a cookie cutter template capability. It's effectively cloning, and you're cloning environment A, environment B, environment C, and they are absolutely identical. And you're taking out the problems that we had many, many years ago of people-driven defined environments where they would go in and they would configure things and unfortunately miss things, or unfortunately just misspell something and cause a problem or forget a config. By relying on the software to do it, and any changes you make, you pump into the software and replay the software, there is literally no reason why an environment build can't be completely repeatable and have the same reliability across the multiple environments that you deploy. And this is obviously a Microsoft area. You know, Microsoft Azure's DevOps is a great example of a capability that you can use in the DevOps space to automate that build and then use pipelines which run and automate the deployment of those environments. Again, you can replicate this on-premise. You know, we're not saying that this can only work in cloud. I guess the question to ask again is at what cost and over what time? The investment and the R&D investment that cloud guys are making makes it considerably easier for you to just come in and operate at the level of let me build my automation without having to worry about building all the layers underneath it to allow you to do the automation. Scalability, obviously, for me, this is probably one of my big things. And again, if I go back to that slide right earlier in the pack where we talked about the NHS in 2007 or 2008, whenever it was, they were very much looking at how they could scale our environment up and down. And I think the idea they had was the right idea. I want to be able to run my environment when I need it, but when I don't need it, I want to turn it off. Now, at that point in time, I know certainly where I was at, we couldn't do that. It just wasn't possible without literally having someone coming in and turning it off in the night and turning it on in the morning, but that was like a full boot down. And again, as an enterprise architect, which I've been during my career, one of my biggest headaches was always, well, how do I size this environment? How do I size it for day one? How do I size it for growth? How do I size it for their peak? And the only way you could do that really was a heck of a lot of maths. You know, there's a lot of information, you know, spreadsheet frenzy. And you'd come up with some pretty stunning calculations, which you'd go through with, you know, the CTO, and then you'd make your recommendations of how to build something. And in reality, all that effort was a best guess, because actually you really couldn't prove it. And the frightening thing would be sometimes you would deploy and then you'd have that problem saying, yeah, I know I said 4 CPUs is all you're going to need, but it looks like you need 16. Sorry, let's go and start buying some more kit. Now, that problem existed, and it probably still exists now. Again, if you're running in an on-premise situation, you're finding suddenly you need to scale quickly. Unless you have hardware sat there within a VM farm or a server farm, you could run into a problem where you've got the need to scale and you simply can't do it. This is one of the power plays that the hyperscale providers have got. I'm going to say they've got infinite scale capability, and I know that's probably a misnomer. You know, they haven't got infinite amount of kit. It's not endless. But I have yet to come across a problem where I suddenly said, I need 16 CPUs and 64 gig of memory right now because I've got a problem and I need to spin something up. The clouds I've used, and I've used probably AWS and GCP more extensively, never had a problem with that at all. And we've done things in both test environments and live environments where we've done things rapidly at scale within an hour and built rather large systems because there is a need to do that. That scalability capability is huge, but also the ability within an existing environment to determine how to scale up and down at what point in time. So as a retailer, you know you've got peaks in a day. You will have, depending on the type of business, you might have an early morning peak. If you get a surge of people in retail, maybe certainly in the UK, the after school peak when people come out, kids come out of schools, parents grab them, disappear to the shops. And then there are obviously end of day actions where maybe back office functions are reconciled, payments are reconciled. And again, they cause different profiles of work in your system. Now, historically, what would you have done? You'd have worked out what the peak is going to be, and you'd have sized for the peak with a bit of buffer for the, oops, I've got this wrong. And obviously, generally was always the best guess, and you often did get it wrong. Now, what you can do is you can idle the system. So if there's a function and feature that is only used at 9 o'clock at night, set it to come up on the capability of users coming in or CPU starting to increase, or there are a number of different factors you can use to tell that machine to spin itself up and increase the number of instances it's got. You can also ask it to be very cost conscious. You can actually say manage it on a cost basis, so keep the cost of the environment down. Obviously, that has an impact on both, I guess, performance and maybe even availability. But the power of being able to do that is also things like the spike periods of the year. So heading towards Black Friday as an example, or Christmas, obviously in the UK and in the US, is you will see a sharp spike in users' capability. The cloud's ability to just scale up for that event and scale back down is something that I think is very, very difficult to replicate in an on-premise capability. And again, you'll find all providers can track that, they can report against that, and they can show how things do work and obviously adjust with every event that occurs. But I've certainly seen systems that can be idling at 2 or 3 instances of something running, and within a very, very short space of time can be running at nearly 200 instances because it's a spike of processing. Obviously, this is not limited to just retailers, clearly. Every company that we come across these days is expected to be thinking on a sustainability basis. And obviously, you don't partner with someone if they're not thinking around sustainability, or maybe certainly I've got some very close friends in corporate digital responsibility. And each of the cloud providers is largely the same. I know on the slide here, it might indicate I'm showing you that they're all different. They're literally all giving you the same information. But what I've tried to do is just show some of the different things each one of them say. So, things like renewable energy by 2025, I think my analysis showed that all of them largely have these types of goals. But again, in a world where energy is obviously a problem and it's obviously very expensive, they're all looking at the efficiency of the data centers, and they're all looking about making sure that they're based on renewable energy. I think AWS, Google, and also Azure are looking to be net carbon neutral within the next sort of 10 to 15 years. The interesting one there, water positivity, Azure, and again, AWS and Google have the same thing. They're trying to use less water. And so to actually consume the same amount of water and use less. And all of them have something around waste management as well. They're diverting waste away from landfill. And the last one now on Google, the power usage effectiveness, again, is showing that they're operating a data center that's very, very power efficient, as opposed to, again, if I go back in my days to how there's very secure data centers were run, and seeing the backup generators, which are generally 4 or 5 tractor engines spinning up to run charge battery power. It certainly couldn't at that point in time claim anywhere near net carbon neutral. So again, the change that's probably gone on in the cloud providers over the last five years or so is very much to keep building themselves at these huge scales, but to do it in a completely sustainable way. So we talked a little bit about as a service. The services that are existing in all of the cloud providers are very much in the cloud marketplaces. The beauty of the cloud marketplaces is you can quite easily just go in, grab something you're interested in, and try it. It is like a shop. You can go in, you can search for products, you can go and search, well, I want an AI tool, or I'm looking for a BI tool, or I want a data lake. And you can find a tool and you can go and try it, have a play with it. You can even enable it into trial. Generally, you'd see a 30-day trial is normally offered. And then eventually, if you like it that much, you then obviously encouraged to pay for it and turn that trial into a paid use on an annual basis or 2-3 yearly basis. The pace of doing these things, I mean, I think I put in my notes here, it's almost mad. It's insane, the fact that you can go in, find something, and immediately start using it. And again, I can give you an example. I had a very small requirement recently where we had a documentation website. All we needed to do within there was enable a search capability within it. And we didn't really want to go code it, we wanted to grab something and plug it in. It was simply a case of go in, grab this service, enable it, and plug it in. And we were done within an hour, and we had it embedded and working within a morning. The ability of the marketplace to plug tools in on a SaaS basis, where we were moved from having a concept of needing to write something to streaming some data into a search service and it's streaming back to our app within a morning, was just crazy pace. So the advantage of that is obviously business agility. You can clearly change your business so quickly by just plugging in tools that exist as SaaS capabilities in the cloud. It can lead to overstimulated architects and engineers. It is like giving a 10-year-old child a bag full of sweets and expect not to have a sugar rush. The engineers I work with, and even some CTOs who I know very, very well, love the concept of being able to go in and try things. I guess the only danger is you can over try sometimes, and you could keep grabbing the next shiny thing that comes up. So that is always a word of warning. Engineers will always gravitate to the next shiny thing. So don't get distracted. But again, from a retailer perspective, as you can see in the middle bit there, if you go into GCP, 110 retailer results in terms of applications are very, very focused at retailers. That's a huge capability of things that you can go in and choose from. So in terms of GCP, this slide came directly from Google Cloud. There are a series of top retail solutions that you can use in there. This is just their top sellers effectively. But there are things in there that I see is quite important. You've got in there the analytics with Looker. There's the warehouse modernization, so that's things like BigQuery. There's capabilities in there that allows a retailer to quickly plug in solutions and start to use them. So quickly the ability to stream data in to a data warehouse or a data lake and then start to visualize it through something like Looker. Again, that can be done without having to go through the worry of procurement cycles, conversation with the vendor, getting the software and installing it. Again, you could be enabling this into trial capability in minutes. And again, I think that's the beauty when I talked earlier about the capability of cloud to transform. Once you're into cloud and starting to get a bit more natively embedded in cloud, starting to be prepared to take the services, whereas historically people would have said, I don't want to embed and take all the services in cloud because then I'm locked in. Now, the reality is as you start to use a cloud, you're going to pick a favorite anyway, and they all do largely the same thing. So you get the best out of cloud by embedding in it and becoming more native and taking the native services. And the minute you start to take those native services, you can enable tools like this immediately. You can start to use them immediately. So if you have, you've got desires in some sort of contact center capability where you want to drive a responsive virtual agent and you want to configure that and play with that and adjust the AI and the machine learning algorithms underneath it, you can do that really, really quickly. It's a SaaS solution, it's a plugin, and you can start working with it and trial it and test it. And again, this is Google Cloud, so they can enable Google G Suite for you. There's even SAP on GCP. There's just so many solutions on here that are very, very pertinent to retail providers. So I guess the final pro tip I would give you all in this session, and let's know this is the last one, is don't just take my word for it. I class myself as an executive geek these days. So I used to be a geek at one point, used to be very hands-on in coding. I'm obviously a long way away from that now, but I'm still deeply interested in the technology side of life. But go into the cloud and explore what the cloud can offer you. You can go into the marketplace now without having an account in GCP or AWS or Azure. Go in and explore the marketplace. See what the marketplace has to offer you. Once you get in there and you start to see some of the tools, you'll realize how quickly you could enable those. I think my personal opinion is it will be a bit of a game changer for you. And again, as long as you consider why the reasons to go to cloud are based around the utilities, not necessarily around cost, I think looking at the marketplaces will give you another lever to say the agility to enable these services so quickly is just of huge benefit. So I guess the parting shot I give you then is just a reminder of those professional tips that I talked about a little bit earlier. Don't make that cloud migration decision purely on cost. There is likely to be a cost saving generally, but it's not going to be such a huge saving that's going to make it just a massive game changer. Maybe it was 10, 15 years ago. It's not the case now, but it's still probably likely a little bit cheaper. But again, it's the utilities of cloud, it's that availability, reliability, your securability, the capability, the agility that you can get through the cloud. They're the things that you should be looking at in terms of going into cloud versus staying on premise. And again, if you're looking at taking a third-party solution capability, a product from a company like ourselves, for example, do that on the basis if they're a cloud provider and they deploy through cloud, in my opinion, it's clearly going to be better to take that through cloud. It's not to say you can't take it and rebuild it into your own hosted capability, but you are risking breaking the application and the deployment, and you're risking not having it run as optimally as it is assured in that provider's capability. And again, as we said in that final bit is, don't take my word for it about cloud, just go and explore it. Go and have a look and go and see what cloud can do for you. So I think, Tara, we've come to almost the end of that 40 minutes. So I think it was about 55 seconds earlier. That's probably all I was going to cover today. So I don't know if you want to open up for any questions to the floor.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ryan. What a wonderful and informative presentation. Before we do dive into our questions, I just want to remind everyone that now is the time to get straight from the source insight from Ryan. And great questions, again, always make for a great webinar. So don't forget to submit yours if you have them. And lastly, we understand if you need to run, just know that today's session is being recorded and will be emailed to you within the next 48 hours. Okay, and if we don't get to your question or comment today, again, you can always connect with Ryan via the channels on screen after the session. So we do have some questions coming in. We have Ricky is asking a little bit about how you secure cloud applications and what types of security parameters there are.
Okay. Crikey, there's so many tools. I mean, it really depends on your application type. But the reality you have to think about is if you were doing this in a hosted and on-premise solution, you would have layers of the security along the way. You'd have different vendor types in terms of your outward-facing router. You'd have different vendor types in terms of your inward-facing router. You would have maybe one or two different firewalls, web application firewalls. It is exactly the same. Migration to cloud doesn't mean suddenly you don't need the network guys and so on, but it just changes their role. So they still configure the same thing. You still consider the flow of your ingress and your egress, and you still configure and change the outbound interfaces, the inbound interfaces, and you still do load balancing within there. It's all the same. It's just the layers of having to go through the low level of it are taken away from you. You can deploy any security service on top of that you're interested in. You can deploy within, if you take virtual machines, you can deploy things in those virtual machines for you yourself to secure them. So I guess the answer really is, don't get too worried about it's a complete change and my old way of doing it isn't right. It's just learning a different way of configuring. And again, you'd probably learn to configure it by clicking around in the admin consoles, but eventually you'd move that into an infrastructure as code basis, and you would simply define all of that security layer and the end-to-end flow in code.
Thank you, Ryan. Absolutely. And if there are any follow-ups to anything we're talking about, please feel free to put those into the Q&A panel as well, so we can bring those up. Our next question is coming in from Derek. Can we talk a little bit more about the different phases of the cloud architecture?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I know Derek can just add a little more elevation on that question. I mean, I'll start, and maybe Derek can add a little bit more on. But your phase of your cloud architecture, again, I think they're very similar to on-premise. It's just that you're defining it in a slightly different way. You might still have to think about the segregation of your applications. You will still think about your layering. So you're still going to come up with the concept of an architectural design. You're still going to do that. You're still going to do an element of sizing, because you'll still have to think about things like, well, how many instances of something do I probably want to start with, and how do I want to grow it? So quite often you might say, well, I'd like 2 minimum instances of something, so that if I'm reliant on one, then I've got a problem. And I actually might want to configure that to make sure that my 2 instances sit on 2 physical different nodes. Again, same thing we've always done as enterprise architects. And then you will say, but in the event of us getting a huge amount of capability coming in, I want that to scale. So I want it to scale in this profile. Do you want that to scale across those 2 nodes or across 3 or 4 nodes? Again, these are all configurations that are there. So again, I think it's the same. It's the same architectural principles you've had in. I don't know if you, Derek, if you're an enterprise architect or solution architect or CTO, CIO type person. The principle of how you define it is still the same. It's a different mindset a little bit in terms of the way you deploy it, because you are deploying it through infrastructure as code first off. So you're going to turn your thought process into code, as it maybe imposed sort of diagrams to give off to the service lines, who will then implement that for you. You will still go through the whole concept of then you build it and you run it. You run a pipeline, and that deploys that into your first test environment, and you'll find out what you've got wrong, which is exactly the same as what you've done previously. But each time you make the change, you don't make the change by jumping in and flipping a config or overwriting a parameter. You make the change back in the software, and you rerun the pipeline. That builds back into the cloud. So the concept of jumping on to a server like we've always done, and changing something manually changes now. Is you change the software and you rebuild from the software to the point where you get everything right, and that's your template, and your template goes. That then obviously goes into the test cycles. You've got developers bringing software or product being deployed. That goes through your standard assurance process. And then you'd still probably go through UAT assurance. Again, it depends how much of that you automate as well. But I'm not sure if that was Derek's question. I don't know, Tara, if he's managed to elevate the question at all.
He actually said what you're saying makes sense, and that was kind of where he was headed. So thank you. Perfect. And our next question is coming in from Emma. She wants to know if we can explain a little bit more about hybrid versus community cloud versus public.
Yeah, okay. So I'll be open. This isn't the community cloud isn't something that I'm well versed on, so I'm probably going to stay away from that one. But the hybrid cloud capability is again, it's kind of a halfway house a little bit, where you've maybe got services that you're hosting on site, and you've got services that you're happy to send out to cloud. And there can be a number of reasons for that. One I'm aware of is you might have a relatively old service sat in an on-premise capability. I mean, I've been in some very strange NHS places back in sort of 2007, 2008, you know, the period in time where you could actually get an appointment at the NHS. And seeing boxes under people's desks with stickers on saying, do not turn this off because we don't know how to turn it back on. Those services might still need to be on-premise. So you're going to have things sat in an on-premise capability and other things sat in a cloud capability. So you'll get some people that are quite happy to say, listen, we can migrate our workload and move it out to the cloud, and we're happy. We're going to turn off and remove our data center capability, our data room capability. There are other people that will say, well, actually, we've got some services that just don't port. You might have some applications that just aren't quite ready for cloud. You might be on some proprietary operating systems that aren't really available in cloud, or actually you say, listen, this doesn't scale very well in cloud, or actually we haven't tried to test it in cloud. So that's where I see the hybrid approach coming in a lot more. The challenge of hybrid will come in that communication between those on-premise and cloud systems. Obviously, we've all got decent networks these days, but obviously the more that's deployed within the cloud region, the faster it will run. You are at risk an element of latency between your on-prem and your cloud capability. And that really would come down to how well defined your network capability is and how redundant that is between the two of them. So I hope that answered the question there. And apologies, I'm not skilled enough to be able to answer the question on community cloud.
Really interesting. Thank you, Ryan. And yes, if there are any follow-ups, again, feel free to submit those for us as well. Another question coming in from Michael, wanting to know if we can talk a little bit more about integrating existing systems with the cloud. Are there, will there be seamless communication between the data centers and the cloud?
Yeah, I can, and again, it really depends on the integration approach. If you go into most of the clouds, they'll offer you some sort of service endpoint, like a Kong, basically a gateway. And the ability to just go and hit the gateway, and the gateway will allow you to then go on and hit services. So that's generally how you'd expect to go from, let's call it off cloud to in cloud. So if you've got a solution that's running, you're just going to be looking to hit an endpoint. And again, it's no different to whether you hosted this in a different data center. It's just that you'll probably be enabling some SaaS tooling within the cloud. You might be enabling services to be run within Kubernetes. You might have, like, say, a gateway like a Kong or an Apogee, or certainly if you're in a Google territory, and that will give you your access. That will give you your front door into the services, and it's almost like a catalog. It will tell you how to get through. Generally, the providers will have some documentation around to explain to you how to communicate with the services. So the Swagger type annotations that you get will generally allow an engineer to know exactly how to communicate with that service. So in general, you'd expect the API type connectivity through a gateway. Obviously, things can also work slightly differently. You might have some systems that do more of a data exchange. And again, there's still a multitude of different ways that you can do that. And there are solutions that are exchanging XML. Sorry, there are solutions that are still taking file transfer. Solutions still based on CSV. And again, you can define applications to just be waiting and listening, potentially even listening on a deployment or movement of a file to a storage bucket, EC2 or anything in Google Cloud. Same in Azure, is they can sit and listen for events, and an event might be the delivery and deployment of a file for transfer. But generally, certainly what we see these days is the expectation of a RESTful endpoint capability sat behind an API gateway.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a few more questions here. I think we have some time left. Let's see. Kind of a follow-up to that. John is asking, does it make sense for my company to hire more IT staff to handle the transition?
Yeah, and it's always a tricky one. When you do a transformation, obviously transformation has been something I've done for many, many years. There's always a sort of executive layer who's going to be looking at, well, how does this save us money? How does this save us cost? How does this save maybe allow us to do a workforce reduction? You definitely need skilled people in cloud. I talked earlier about exploring, go and try, and it's a superb way to learn. But also having a guide with you who's an expert in, a cloud certified architect or maybe cloud certified engineer, they're important people to have. Now, you need to have a pathway to map your people into that and obviously change their behaviors a little bit. So change away from being used to physically touching the router or the firewall or the server into configuring something that they can't physically touch and see. It's possible initially you might need slightly more people with different skill sets, or as you maybe get attrition, you replace them with people with slightly different skill sets. But you definitely need cloud capable people, cloud expertise. We're probably erring towards a conversation around DevOps. The capability of DevOps, who are generally those people that are automating and bridging the gap between applications and SRE type functions. They're also generally people who are cloud certified engineers as well, because generally they're doing their work in cloud. They're automating in and around cloud predominantly. I'm not saying in totality. So it might be a case of maybe recruiting certain types of people to be the guides, and maybe through maybe potentially attrition is hiring people who've got maybe more skills in and around the cloud capability maybe than the on-premise capability.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you for the great questions. Looks like we have time for one more here. Rose is asking, what are some of the backup and recovery options with cloud?
Oh, crikey. You probably need another hour-long session to go through that. But the cloud capability, if you're going to go back to the availability slide that I showed a bit earlier with the regions and the data centers, the majority of the services that run, sort of, Google Cloud SQL or, Azure SQL. I think I always forget the AWS one, but they are built to run across 3 data centers in a region. It's not where we had it previously, where we were having to worry about, well, I've got to put a server in rack 1 and a server in rack 2, and I had to figure out how to cluster them together. So and I'm fully available should one go down. You have one as an active, one as a primary. Well, those SQL tools, as an example, as the cloud SQL capability, they're just literally striped across all 3. So if you lose one of the availability zones, the other 2 just carry on picking it up. It's done through the exchange of data. That's done on a backbone between the data centers. It's almost, well, it is almost real time, because they're able to offer that 0 recovery point objective. So they're confident that between those 3 data centers, it is completely replicated. So it really comes to you to be a configuration of how to use that. Now, you can go another way. You can go and deploy your own VMs, for an example, and you can deploy your own database capability on it, but that requirement would fall to you then to configure the replication. So certainly the advice I would give to anyone is, if you've got a relatively open, or I'm going to say call it normal SQL, like Postgres, for example, there are tools out there. Every cloud provider has a tool that will allow you to run Postgres or some sort of SQL variant, like in the MySQL family. Take the service. The service will just under the covers do that for you. And it would be as much as just clicking, I want high availability. And it literally is that simple.
Thank you, Ryan. I know there was a ton of information and there was a couple of questions we didn't get to, so I absolutely encourage you to follow up with Ryan after the session to get some more information. With that being said, that is all the time that we have for today. I hope you all learned half as much as I did. Thanks again to our sponsor, Fluid, and Ryan, a big special thank you to you for such a phenomenal webinar today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Yes, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Tara, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. Take care.